Hi everyone, welcome to the July 1st edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mokowski, and this week we're looking ahead to Saturday's card at Churchill Downs, where they are running one of the highlights of their spring-summer meet, the Grade 2 Stephen Foster, one of a few stakes on that Saturday card. There is an all-stakes pick 5 sequence, but Craig and I are going to focus on the late pick 5 sequence on this podcast as we discuss races 8 through 12. The Stephen Foster is right in the middle as race 10. We are covering a couple of the other stakes, the Grade 2 Fleur-de-lis for the fillies and mares on the main track, as well as the Kelly's Landing for sprinters. All of these races are on the main track, as Churchill Downs, you probably saw reported, has suspended turf racing through the end of this meet, so it's an entire day of dirt racing on Saturday, which, Craig, I know you're not too upset about. These stakes races, some of them have drawn some horses that were meant for turf, mostly in the races a little bit earlier in the day. But the last couple of races as part of this sequence, allowance races, both are pretty interesting. I think could make the sequence pay better than it otherwise would with just those stakes involved.
Yeah, I definitely think this is the better sequence than the all stakes pick 5. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against turf races. I just think they're more work for our show, which is no problem. I love betting them. I think they offer plenty of value. But for handicapping purposes, I do find dirt races easier. Maybe it's because I've grown up as a figure guy and dirt was always easier than turf. But I think it's a decent sequence nonetheless.
Yeah, Craig, I know you did handicap a couple of the other earlier stakes, the Tepin and I believe the American Derby. So if you have any opinions at the end of the show, maybe you can give those out. But we're going to start off with race 8, the Grade 2 Fleur-de-lis. And this is one of the lesser competitive races in the sequence, as just a field of 5 is signed on for these fillies and mares to go the 1.125 distance. And feels like there are 3 major contenders in the number 4, Pauline's Pearl, and the number 5, She Dares the Devil, who faced off in the Grade 1 La Troyenne earlier in the year, as well as Super Quick, who's coming off a blowout victory at Pimlico in the Hilaire Dupont. And I guess the conversation, Craig, kind of goes through that ladder runner, Super Quick, and what do you do with her, and can she run back to that last out speed figure?
Yeah, that's a tough one for me. I'm kind of skeptical. I'll be honest. I actually loved her that day. I didn't think she was going to run off the screen and win by a football field, but I'm skeptical that she can repeat that performance. Even though it's only a field of 5, this is a much tougher field than what she saw at Pimlico. She was able to establish a clear early lead. Admittedly, she was going fast, and she's probably going to try those same tactics from the inside here. But I just think she's going to have to deal with some challenges earlier, particularly from the outside, and She Dares the Devil.
Yeah, She Dares the Devil certainly can stalk, and she's been successful from a stalking position in the past, but it seems like recently her connections have really preferred to get her to the front end. I'm not sure if that's going to be possible in this race with Super Quick in the field, especially breaking from the inside. It is interesting, Florent Giroux, who rode Super Quick in her last race, kind of unsurprisingly goes with the trainer that he has the stronger relationship with, Brad Cox, and he's going to stick with She Dares the Devil in this race, but a rider who does know the number 1 Super Quick will be on She Dares the Devil. So kind of an interesting pace dynamic between those two. And it's not like the number 3 Ava's Grace is that slow. So even though it's a field of just 5 runners, it does feel like this is a pace that could heat up a little bit on the front end.
Yeah, we're almost never going to have a 5-horse field labeled as having a fast pace, but I had similar thoughts, and my top pick in here is actually Pauline's Pearl. I know she disappointed last time out in the Shawnee Stakes when she was 2-5 and was beaten off the board, actually, only beaten a 2.5 lengths. But I thought she had some excuses that day. She was really wide all the way into the first turn. And I also wonder if that was really the goal. I mean, it's a big purse, but this is obviously a Grade 2. She was coming out of a Grade 1 win that day. And these are fillies and mares. They tend to throw in clunkers a little more often than you see from colts. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going out of form, and I just think she's one that's going to get a nice setup. Now, she's going to have to deal with She's All Wolf, who came from off the pace last time to win, but I just think she's a better overall filly, and maybe that one was a little bit of a fluke result. So, yeah, if I had to make a top pick in here, it would be Pauline's Pearl because of that pace scenario you were talking about.
Yeah, she definitely does feel like the horse that's supposed to trip out in this race. Maybe getting Joel Rosario back on her back is going to help her here, whereas Luis Saez rode her last time. Not that Saez did anything wrong, but sometimes certain riders just develop relationships with horses. Pauline's Pearl, she did finish fourth last time. A little surprising to me that she wasn't put up for third, as it seemed to me like Ava's Grace had committed an infraction and probably should have been disqualified in that race. But Pauline's Pearl, aside from that minor steady at the very end, she really didn't have a major excuse last time. So, I mean, if you're willing to draw a line through that race, she does look pretty formidable here, given the trip that she's supposed to get. I'm not totally convinced with her. She would need to be the third choice in the wagering for me to want her here, because I do think that the other two are a bit more reliable, just super quick, having shown that she's in such strong form right now. And She Dares the Devil, who I know She Dares the Devil has disappointed at short prices a number of times over the past year, but she still almost always shows up with a competitive effort. I mean, she's right there in all of her races, and she does seem like she typically runs her good efforts at Churchill Downs. So I'm not against She Dares the Devil by any means. If you put a gun to my head, I'd probably say that She Dares the Devil is the most likely winner of this race. But my thoughts about this affair kind of go along the way that the morning line has them pegged. So I just don't really have any clever thoughts. And reluctant as I am to say it, I'm kind of tempted to go three deep in this race because I don't have a strong opinion about anyone. And I wouldn't be surprised if any of the three favorites won.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, part of my thinking on Pauline's Pearl is she is the third choice on the morning line. But luckily, we will get to see what the betting looks like. And, sometimes you get surprised. If Super Quick was to be 7-2 in here, I'd probably put her on top. If She Dares the Devil was 7-2, I'd put her. But it's for exactly the reasons you mentioned. I had a hard time separating them. The other two I'm definitely not going to use. I mean, I guess you could make a case for them. It's not like they're hopeless long shots in here, but it just seems like they're a hair bit slower than the others to me, and everything would have to go perfectly.
Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, the Kelly's Landing overnight stakes, going 6.5 furlongs on the main track. And we've got a pretty high-profile runner in here, Craig, and the number 4, Aloha West, who, of course, was last year's upset Breeders' Cup Sprint winner. Aloha West has lost his first couple of starts this season, but, I mean, can't really fault him for losing to runners like Jackie's Warrior and Flightline, Speaker's Corner. They've tried some pretty tough spots with him coming off the layoff, and it just seems like maybe he's getting the appropriate class relief here.
Yeah, it's a speed figure maker. He's the horse to beat. I mean, he's run, despite losing pretty handily, he's basically run the same race he did in the Breeders' Cup Sprint, which seems crazy. But that was a below par race for the class last year. But it doesn't mean he's a bad horse. And his speed figures are just better than everybody else in here. So he's definitely going to be an A for me. He does have decent tactical speed. It's not like he has to come from way back to win. The pace projector doesn't show a whole lot of speed in this race. So I'm going to lean pretty heavily on Aloha West. Another horse that I'm going to use is the horse shown on the lead in that pace projector, Knee Deep in Snow. He's one that ran off a $80,000 claim from Mike Maker last time, but I thought he ran pretty deceptively well at Hawthorne that day. He was kind of pinned inside in a quick pace. Those two drew away the top two from the field. He lost to a horse named Isolate that day, but I thought he ran deceptively well and could get a jump on some of the others. I guess if you look at the other, Bango is one that people are going to want to use. He has a great record at Churchill. I always seem to be against Bango, but for me, it's really hard to see him beating Aloha West in here.
Yeah, I kind of have similar opinions about this. I doubt these two are going to be as close as they are on the morning line, with Aloha West pegged at 2-1 and Bango at 5-2. I would imagine there's a much bigger gap between those runners, with Aloha West perhaps going shorter in this race. Yeah, I don't want to sing the praises of a horse that's going to be a decisive favorite, but it just seems like Aloha West is probably a cut above this field. I'm not going to be too hard on him for those last couple of losses. I never really viewed him as a horse that wanted to go a mile, so I'm not going to fault him for fading at the end of that Metropolitan Handicap last time. And it's not like he ran that badly off the layoff behind Jackie's Warrior in the Churchill Downs. There was no pace in that race. I thought that they made the right move to try to get him a little bit closer to Jackie's Warrior glory in the early going, but it just didn't work out because he's a horse that naturally wants to come from a little bit farther off the pace than that. But I mean, I thought, like you said, he ran decently in those races, and those efforts are probably going to be good enough to beat this field. He is getting Joel Rosario back aboard, who has ridden him to a couple of victories in the past, not really concerned about that rider switch. He just seems like he's super logical in here, and I would lean most heavily on him. The other horse that I would want to use as the primary backup for me is the number 1 Awesome Jerry, who, Craig, I've liked in the past a little bit, but just seems like he's in great form right now. He's won his last 2 in a row, and he proved that 20-1 win at Keeneland was no fluke when he came back last time at Churchill and beat another solid field with a similar speed figure. And what I liked about his last race at Churchill is he's a horse that had shown speed in the past, and it seemed like he had lost it for a long time, but suddenly that early speed that he once possessed was back in that recent race at Churchill, as he was aggressively used from the inside post and set a legitimate pace that day to win over Gunnett, a horse that came back to actually run a pretty nice speed figure in defeat at Churchill last week. So I think Awesome Jerry is in pretty good form right now, and I'm not going to be surprised, given the pace situation in this race, if he ends up a lot more forward than what he's shown on the pace projector.
Yeah, I have no argument with that. I mean, I know why he is there on the pace projector, because the last race seemingly came out of nowhere where he was up front. All the others in recent PPs were pretty far back. But when you look through his, if you scroll through his lifetime PPs, you can see he did have speed. He showed it last time. So I would tend to agree with you. I think he'll be closer up. I do think the 3 will be setting the pace, but I think he'd be in pretty close attendance. So I have no real knocks on him. His speed figures are probably the second best in the field. So yeah, he's going to be on my tickets. More as a C-type. I still would lean most heavily on Aloha West. But for me, those 2 that I mentioned, Knee Deep in Snow and him, would be more backups to Aloha West.
Yeah, my big problem with Knee Deep in Snow, who I acknowledge is supposed to get the right trip in this race, is that victory 2 back at Keeneland, you see in the TimeformUS PPs, there is a bright red color coding in the race rating box for a speed favoring track. And when I scroll through the charts for that day, it does seem pretty pronounced that speed horses really had an advantage. And if you actually look at some of the other wire-to-wire winners on that card, a few of them have run back and done much more, have run much worse in their subsequent starts after winning in gate-to-wire fashion at Keeneland on April 29th. So I'm a little bit skeptical of that big speed figure that Knee Deep in Snow ran that day, because his other surrounding numbers just don't really put him in the same league as some other horses in here. But he is supposed to get the right trip up front, and maybe that's going to be good enough to help him achieve a better result against this pretty high-quality field in the Kelly's Landing on Saturday at Churchill.
Yeah, I have no problem. That's an accurately designated speed bias coding, in my opinion. And I'm glad you brought it up, because we're going to talk about that later for a later race.
Let's move on to the feature race on Saturday at Churchill Downs. It is the Grade 2 Stephen Foster going 1 1/8 for the older horses. And Craig, this is arguably a Grade 1 quality field, as we have some pretty talented runners in here. I kind of mentioned a few of them at the top of the show. Included among them are Mandaloon, who came back from Saudi Arabia to run in this race, but obviously one of the top 3-year-olds from last year, the put-up winner of the Kentucky Derby. You've got Olympiad, who is just riding a winning streak, appears to be in great form right now. American Revolution, who seemed to be on his way to becoming one of the best older horses in the country last year, but came off the layoff with a slightly disappointing effort last time. And there are a lot of others to consider here too. This is a high-quality field.
Yeah, this is a tough race for sure. I think you could go a lot of different directions. The one real opinion that I have in here is that I think Olympiad's a bit overrated. I've actually been a fan of this horse. When I scroll through his speed figures, they're not very strong. He's never in a race with a quick pace. His PPs are just, there's blue fractions everywhere, like almost every single race, and not a single red one to be found. He could win this race. I'm not saying he couldn't. He's obviously a high-quality horse, but I think this is by leaps and bounds the sternest test that he's had yet. And I think there's some others in here who could beat him and that I'm definitely going to prefer.
I pretty much agree with that assessment. You know that I've liked this horse for a long time. I think that I was not surprised when he won these series of races at the fairgrounds and coming on to Churchill last time. But the waters are getting deeper here, and he feels like the kind of horse where even though he's won going the 1 1/8, That's probably going to be his limit. I think he's naturally just more of a mile or mile and a 16th type. And like you said, he has just gotten such perfect trips in his races. Slow paces. He's been able to use his turn of foot and speed to sprint at the end of these route races. It's harder to do that and get that kind of trip against a high quality field like this going a mile and an eighth. Not going to be shocked if he wins again, but I just feel like he could go favorite in this race. I feel like it feels like there's a lot of positive buzz about this horse, and I'm not sure that I would want to take that short a price on him, considering the competition. Craig, I do have a question for you before we discuss some of the other contenders. Who do you think is going to be on the lead in this race? Because it feels like it's going to be a real chess match between the three inside drawn runners, Caddo River, American Revolution, and Olympiad. I know American Revolution is shown on the lead in the pace projector. It's not really his style. It feels like there are a few different riders that could decide to get aggressive here. How are you viewing this pace situation?
This one's pretty tricky, and I'm kind of letting post position be my guide. And I think Caddo River almost has to go from the inside. I also think he's kind of gotten his speed back. He seemed to have lost it for a while there. And I don't want to, he's not my top pick, but he's definitely a horse I'm going to use as an A-type horse. I kind of get a Knicks Go vibe with him where he just lost it for a while, wasn't running very well. And now he seems to be back and he's running big speed figures. Last time was almost like a paid workout. But I suspect from the inside, he's got no choice but to go. He's been drawn outside in his last 3 wins, was able to rate a little bit. But if they want to win this race, I don't think they want to give a head start to either of the two is outside.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of Caddo River in this race. I agree with your assessment. I think if there's a most likely early leader in this race, it's probably him breaking from the inside, especially with his uncoupled stablemate Mandaloon being a horse that can come from a little bit off the pace. You would imagine that Brad Cox would want to have this horses use 2 different running styles. I'm not sure what to make of the fact that they kind of maxed out his allowance conditions. Maybe they just kept running in those allowance races because they were available and the purses are so hefty these days. I mean, he's made almost $225,000 having not run at a stake so far this year. But I also wonder if maybe they ran in those races because he could have Lasix, and he's a horse that his last few races without the Lasix were not so good. And you wonder if they tried to keep him in those races to use the Lasix. Maybe I'm making too much of that, but I think it's an interesting question as he has to come off the Lasix to race in this graded stakes race with Foster. We'll see what we get from him. I'm not sure if he's going to be 10-1 as he is on the morning line, but he's definitely a horse that I think could have an impact on this race. What do you make of Cox's other runner, Mandaloon, who's coming back from Saudi Arabia? Obviously did not run well on that Saudi Cup, but prior to that, it looked like he had taken a step forward as a 4-year-old, putting up that big speed figure in his prep for that overseas trip to Louisiana Stakes when he beat Midnight Bourbon. I mean, I don't want to just forget about him. He's a good horse.
No, I think he's the horse to beat in this field. We gave that race a little bit of a pace upgrade, the one in Louisiana, and it's proven pretty good. I mean, the other speed figures from the race have come back just fine. All the horses seem to have been running back to him. So I think it's legit, and it's just a matter of how much do you think Brad Cox has him cranked up. This is a pretty high class grade 2 race, one that I don't think he'd be in here just for a workout. So I suspect he is meant to run well here. And for me, he's the horse to beat. I don't think he's going to offer a lot of value, but I'm definitely going to have him on my ticket because I don't want to get knocked out if he wins it, as he likely could.
Yeah, I agree. I think he is the horse to beat in this race, and I do believe he deserves to be the favorite. I'm not totally convinced he will be, given the presence of Olympiad, but I do think that Mandaloon is the most likely winner. Though the horse that I'm most interested in, just from a value standpoint, is the number 2 American Revolution. We talked about this a little bit, Craig, when we recapped the Blame Stakes on the TimeformUS Pacecast. A horse that was not originally targeted at that race. He was supposed to run a New York bred race at the end of May. That seemed like it was coming up very soft. That race didn't fill. Pletcher had to reroute at the last minute to send him to Churchill to run in the Blame. I don't think he ran that badly. That pace did come apart a little bit, even though the fractions don't appear to be that fast, but he did make the move into that race, and he was passed at the end by horse like Dynamic One and Proxy, the latter of which is in here, but I just feel like that was a good prep for American Revolution, and and he is supposed to be able to take a step forward this time. He's going to have to, because this is a high-quality field, but this is a horse who last year looked like he could reach this level, and I think if he's able to take that step forward, he can do it here.
Yeah, he's the one that's going to be my top pick. For most of the reasons you mentioned, I think that last race he was probably a little bit short. Maybe wasn't ready for that kind of competition. And that was a fast race. And similar to Pauline's Pearl, although with more of an excuse, he was really hung wide on that first turn. The pace was pretty quick early. As you said, it did come apart. And that's just the kind of trip I always want to bet back. And he just has a lot of things pointing favorably in his direction in here. I do think he's going to offer some value. I think he might get overlooked a little bit with Mandaloon and Olympiad in here, so he would definitely be my top pick. I expect a much better race. And again, I don't think he ran that bad. That was a fast race. His speed figure wasn't very far off of his best efforts as a 3-year-old, and I expect a forward move in here to even like the 130 range.
One more horse that I want to mention before we move on from this race is the number 7 Last Samurai. He's the winner of the Grade 2 Oaklawn Handicap last time, and he did it in pretty impressive fashion. I know he didn't get much respect that day going off at 12-1, but he beat a decent couple of horses in Fearless and Plainsman pretty decisively. Is this just too big of a step up in class, even though it's another Grade 2 event? This is a higher quality field than the Oaklawn Handicap. He is a 4-year-old that's moving in the right direction. I don't want to totally discount the fact that he's just improving.
No, I can see that. I'm curious about the barn change. Not sure what's going on there from Dallas Stewart to Wayne Lucas. But for me, he's just a couple lengths too slow in here. It's a step up, as you say. They're both grade 2s, but I could make the argument that that Oaklawn race was more a grade 3, where this is more grade 1, as you mentioned earlier. The Oaklawn race, I mean, he beat Fearless. Fearless had stretched out to 1.5 miles to finally get his win on Belmont Day. I know you were a fan of his, but I just don't consider Fearless a top horse. So that race, Plainsman 2, he's more of a grade 3 type than a grade 1 or 2 type. So he's going to offer a good price in here. So if you like him, good. But I just don't think he has very good chance of winning.
Yeah, I'm not that high on him in the sense that I would make him a top pick in this race, but he's the kind of horse that I think could get somewhat ignored once again, and I would want to use him on some backup tickets because I am a fan of this horse, and I think that he's just heading in the right direction right now, though he's going to need a career best to beat this field. Craig, let's move on to the last couple of races to close out this pick 5 sequence. So both have large fields. Things don't get easier as we move on to these optional claiming races. Race 11, optional claiming 62,500, non-winners of 2 other than for the fillies and mares, going 7 furlongs. And this one feels pretty wide open, and I feel like we're going to have a similar opinion on the morning line favorite here, the number 11 Milfoy, who I suppose got a confidence builder last time, but just looks like she needs to get faster to beat this field.
Yes, if Milfoy wins, I lose because she's not the kind of horse I want on my ticket in a race like this. She's going to be underlaid for sure, and she just hasn't developed at all. I know we both like some of her 2-year-old races. I mean, she was a horse who was beaten less than a length. She looked like she had Malathot beat and was run down, but it was a good effort, and she just hasn't progressed at all. Her speed figures are basically the same. She was running that 2, so I don't want any parts of her at a short price. She's got some other disadvantages to overcome, including the 11 post. Not a lot of pace in here. She's turning back in distance to 7 furlongs, something that I don't think is something that she's going to like, to be honest. She seems like a horse who the more distance, the better. So I'm not sure what's up with that other than, as you mentioned, these conditioned allowances have such huge purses. It's almost like they're going to come back into vogue where trainers are going to want to run in them and get horses through the conditions to make the money. But she's definitely one I'm not using and totally against her.
Yeah, there's a horse in here that I think might prove to be pretty tough just given the trip that she's likely to pull, and that's the number 8 Altered Shot. I'm guessing that you respect this horse as well, Craig. I mean, she's looking for her 4th victory in a row, and it's not easy to keep moving up in class like this when you're moving through allowance conditions. I mean, she won her starter race 2 back, N1X last time. Now she's moving up to the N2X. but it just feels like she's supposed to get to the front end here. And there's not a lot of speed in this race for an 11 horse field. You see the Timeform US pace projector has that blue flag for the favors on or near the lead situation, and she's supposed to be the biggest beneficiary of that. I guess the biggest question is, can she get the 7 furlongs?
Yeah, that is a big question for me. I'm gonna have to use her because the tactical advantage looks pretty good, but it does worry me a little bit. She won at 6.5, but that was a much cheaper company. You can see the race ratings in Timeform US. The last race was an off the turf race at only 5.5, so that's her best speed figure by quite a bit. So I don't know how much stock I want to put in that 5.5 furlong race going 7. I do think she's one I'm going to use, but I'm going to look at a few other horses in here that I like a little more. Uh, I want to hear your opinion of the one I like most. That's the one horse, Be Like Water. She just seems like a horse to me that kind of got lost with her connection. She started out in a 7 furlong maiden dirt race, ran really well that day, first out to lose by less than a length. Then they stretched her out around 2 turns a couple times. Then they put her on turf for a bunch, and really didn't run very well in any of them. Her first turf attempt was okay, I guess, and then things went downhill. But since they've got her back on dirt, she's rolled both times. She broke her maiden finally at 6.5 at Keeneland against a pretty solid field with a decent speed figure, and she stepped up to do it in the non-winners of 1 at Churchill. Improved her speed figure a little bit more. I like how she's drawn here. I think she's finally on the right surface. And I just think even with the 2 wins, her form is a little bit hidden in that she's probably a lot better horse. If you only showed those 3 dirt sprints that she's running, she'd probably be a lot less than that 10-1 morning line we see.
Yeah, I don't disagree that she's definitely a dirt horse. I gave her a long look just based on those dirt races. I wish she was a little bit faster. Her last race, I watched it, and she was best that day. I mean, she looked like she was always traveling well, and she reeled in that leader, Minute Waltz, who had gotten the jump on her. I don't like that Minute Waltz came back to run so poorly in her next start, and I just wonder a little bit about the quality of that last race. It felt like a subpar N1X allowance, and now she's moving up against the tougher field. I mean, she's not that far off a horse like Milfoy from a speed figure standpoint, so I definitely think she's a much better bet than that runner at probably 3 times the price. But I just preferred some others in this race, though obviously not trying to talk you off a horse that could be decent odds in here. The horse that I think is pretty interesting is the number 7, Sterling Miss. She's one who's switching from turf to dirt, but I think that she's definitely more of a dirt horse. She's won 10 times on this surface, and I think it's kind of interesting in a race where you've got a lot of horses racing for the allowance condition. She's an 11-time winner facing a lot of horses that have just won 2 races, and her last few dirt races, the speed figures stack up really well against this field. She faced some solid runners in a few of those spots, just barely lost to a horse named Assertive Style at Fairgrounds back in February. That runner has since gone on to do some nice things. I think was even a distant third in a graded stakes in New York recently. And it just feels like moving into the Joe Sharp barn, there's the potential she could take a step forward. Joe Sharp does an excellent job with his claims at Churchill Downs, especially on the dirt. So I think she's interesting, and I like where she's shown in the pace projector. She should get a good stalking trip in this race.
Yeah, I've got no issues with her. Just say an 11-time winner is going to be dangerous. She's definitely one that I have on my tickets. I have one more I wanted to bring up, and that's a horse just to her inside, Honor Rafik. Uh, I thought her last race is just a total line out when you watch the replay. And it's not so much there's a comment that she got squeezed at the start. Watching the head on, the start really wasn't that bad. What I think happened to her is kind of on the backstretch, her rider worked his way inside Tyler Gaffleone. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But he just kind of got stuck. He got himself in a spot where he had absolutely nowhere to go. He wasn't really steadying or checking, but while he was in that spot, the top 2 in the field were just running off. The pace was quick. They opened up a huge gap. The winner wound up drawing off, and it was just kind of a race where she had no chance. And I think if you look at her race 2 back, I thought she ran pretty well in a narrow loss at His Splendid News that day. She got a speed figure that fits really well here. And I just think this is a field that she could certainly compete. My one issue is the lack of pace. She's a horse who does like to come from off of it, but sometimes it's 7 furlongs. That's not as important as in the shorter sprints. So she's definitely one I'm going to use on my ticket.
Yeah, I don't have a big problem with her. I agree with her race 2 back. I thought she ran well that day. I also wanted to give a slight shout out to the number 4, Regal Retort, who kind of has a similar look to Honorifique. They were both in that race, won by Tis Splendid News. Honorifique finished a little better than Regal Retort did that day. But I thought Regal Retort got a bit of a trip last time in that claiming race, shuffled back on the turn. She just kind of Joel made the wrong move trying to go inside of a tiring runner, had to alter course, lost momentum. Probably should have won that race. She has back races that would make her pretty tough in here, but it's just a question of whether Asmussen can get her back into form. No guarantee, and she's another that would need some pace help up front that she might not get in here. Let's move on to the final race of this sequence and the final race of the day at Churchill on Saturday. It is a N1X allowance race going 1 mile and 3/16 on the dirt. Distance could be important here as you're going to need some stamina to win going this trip. And Craig, it's a pretty wide open affair. I guess the 2 horses that are going to take the most money are coming out of a loss at this level behind Cool House back in the middle of May, those being Alejandro and Greatheart. The former, Alejandro, who was second that day, is just kind of a tough horse to trust on the win end because he has a propensity to hang a little bit in the late stages of his races.
He does, but I have to admit, in this spot, I have to use him. It just seems like the perfect spot for me. I do think he's actually going to get a little bit of pace this time. There's more speed. There's a sprinter stretching, or a horse coming out of a sprint race stretching out that's shown on the lead in the pace projector. He definitely had a bit of a tough trip last time. He kind of wanted to run, had to stop and start a couple of times. I do worry about a horse that's 1 for 11 with 6 seconds. You have to wonder how much will there is to win, but there's a lot of positives for this horse as well. He's got good speed figures, and I just thought his effort last time is a lot better than it looked because of the trip. And it was also, I mentioned about speed biases earlier. That was a pretty strong speed bias day at Churchill. It's another one when you look through the charts you can see why it has that designation. A lot of horses were right there on the lead in the dirt races that won. Nearly all were on the lead. They weren't all favorites. A couple of them have come back to not run so great. So I just think he had a lot of things against him that day, and he's the one that I think the mile and a 3/16 really fits. So I'm using him pretty strongly in here. One or two others I'll talk about, but I'm curious what you think about him and his last race in particular.
No, I don't disagree. We saw a lot of the same things. I mean, he did hang a little bit at the end as he's wont to do, but he had some trouble that day. I didn't scroll through the charts that much to check out that speed bias, but I trust that you think it's legitimate. And yeah, I thought his race 2 back at the distance, the one that I was mentioning with Greatheart. I mean, he ran fine that day too. He just edged out Greatheart at the very end of that race. They're the 2 obvious horses in here, and I can't really knock their form too much. They've got the speed figures to be competitive at this level, and they get the distance. It just feels like there were a few others that I wanted to highlight that maybe had back class or could get back to their best races, but those horses who will be better prices just need to improve a little bit to beat these 2. A horse that I do want to mention, Craig, is the number 3, Bourbon Thunder, who I was trying really hard to make a case for because he's got back speed figures that make him faster than both of the favorites that he was running last summer when he was a good third in that allowance race behind Dak Daniels at Saratoga, then ran decently in a couple of stakes, including the Bourbon Trail, where he was a distant second to King Fury, even was a solid fourth in the West Virginia Derby. Came off the layoff last time, and didn't that just feel like a pure prep race? I know he was last of 10, but 7 furlongs is on the short side for him. He was shuffled back on the turn a little bit. I'm not going to be surprised when this horse runs a lot better in this spot.
He was definitely one, and you actually used the same exact words. I tried really hard to make a case for him, and I think I did it. I'm going to use him. I think that last race is a total throwout. He has speed figures and races good enough to win, as you mentioned. That West Virginia Derby was good. So was that stakes race at the Bourbon Trail against. It's funny, he's Bourbon Thunder, but it was the Bourbon Trail Stakes. King Fury ran off from the field, but he passed quite a few to get in the second that day. So he's one that I'm definitely going to use. I do worry that it's a bit much to go from 7 to 9.5 furlongs off of a 6-month layoff. But as you said, there's no way that race was anything more than a paid workout.
Yeah, another horse that I wanted to mention is the number 11, Tis Ride Time, who is a horse that ran well against some tough competition last year. When in different barns, I thought he was a good second behind Injunction going the mile distance at Churchill back at the end of November. Since then, he's been primarily racing against weaker companies, starter allowance, claiming fields, but he's been achieving some better results, and it seems like he's in good form right now, or at least he was when we last saw him at the end of April for the barn that he's in. And just given the way he runs, I'm not against him stretching out in distance, and he feels like another that could be a price in this race.
Yeah, I've got no problem with him. I did want to get to Greatheart a little bit as the second choice. He's one that I'm not going to use. I figure if he couldn't beat Alejandro that day, I'm not sure how he's ever going to beat him. I know it was just a head at the wire, but he actually had a pretty darn good trip that day, couldn't hold him off. So he's the reason I'm going to use a couple others because I'm not going to use him.
And who else do you want to mention, Craig? We haven't really talked about a whole lot of speed in this race. I guess the number 8 C Falls could be up front. We'll see if he can get the distance. But who else were you interested in?
The other horse I like in here is Mr. Tip. He's been running, going back and forth between dirt and turf in his career. He's been over his head in the last couple on turf. He's run decent speed figures while not really being competitive. But I think his dirt races fit just fine in here. He hasn't tried it in a little bit, but the times he has, he's run plenty triple digit speed figures, and at 12-1, that's good enough for me to have on the ticket.
The one bomb that I would throw into the mix is the number 1, Keep Calm Carry On, who I know looks way too slow, but Steve Margolis has good numbers off trainer switches. This horse was ridden down to a rail that might not have been the place to be in Monmouth last time, and just a horse that looked like he had potential when he won that 1.125 maiden race at Saratoga last summer, and not going to be surprised when he takes a big speed figure step forward. I think the distance is right for him. We'll just see if he can stack up against this field, but it feels like he's one that's going to be a pretty big price in this race. So definitely different ways to go as we close out this sequence. Craig, before we close out, I know you handicapped a couple of those stakes early on. Did you like anything in those races, or were they just not ones that interested you that much?
Not particularly. I was pretty glad when you said we were doing the late pick 5 as opposed to the all-state pick 5. Had a little bit of wasted time on there. But yeah, nothing really jumped out at me. I didn't love anybody in either one of those two races. I think they're pretty tough handicapping puzzles, but it's not a sequence I'll be playing.
Well, that's it for this Pick 5 sequence. I think we went through it pretty in depth, Craig. I'll briefly just kind of go through the sequence again as we do a little recap. I think we both agreed that, we would use all 3 of the favorites in that Fleur-de-lis in some capacity. Maybe Pauline's Pearl, a bit of a push for you, I think you said. We're both going to lean on Aloha West. He just looks pretty tough in that Kelly's Landing Stakes. We had a similar opinion in that Stephen Foster. Both liking American Revolution and respecting Mandaloon. I would use Last Samurai as a little bit of a backup. And Craig, just kind of summarize how you would go about those last couple of legs.
Yeah, we were similar. I'm glad we're going to get to see the odds board because that's probably going to sway me a little bit in the first leg, but I'm not going to get knocked out if any of those 3 win. In the second leg, as you said, definitely leaning on Aloha West. I will use Knee Deep in Snow a little bit as a backup just in case he forgets to stop on the front end. The Foster you covered pretty good. I don't want to use Olympiad in here. He's going to be too short, and I like some others. I will be using Caddo River. I got the impression you didn't like him as much, but I think he's dangerous if he gets to the front. But I do prefer American Revolution and Mandaloon. Another horse we didn't really mention that I don't want to totally dismiss is Proxy. He's a horse that seems to be moving in the right direction, but he might be a little overbet. But he's one, if I was playing verticals, I'm not going to totally dismiss him. And then the last 2, I think we were pretty similar in the 11th. I'm against Mealfoy. Going to spread quite a bit. I like the 6 horse on a Reek. Altered Shot has a chance. I like Be Like Water, I believe, is my top pick in there. But definitely one I want to get through. And then the last race, I'm going to lean a little bit on Alejandro. He would be my only A, but I would use definitely about 3 or 4 others in B and C type positions.
Yeah, and in those last two, just to kind of add to what Craig said, I would lean most heavily on Sterling Miss and Altered Shot in that 11th race. I would use Be Like Water, Regal Retort, and even Honor Rafik as backups on Craig's say-so. Made solid cases for those horses. Then to close things out, I do like that number 3, Burp and Thunder. He's one that I would want to use pretty prominently. Not really against the favorites, Greatheart or Alejandro, viewing them similarly. But I would want to throw in that long shot that I mentioned, Keep Calm, Carry On, as another backup that could get in there to spice things up at a big price at the end of this sequence. Well, that's it for our handicapping of Churchill on Saturday. We'll, of course, be back on the TimeformUS Pacecast next week to recap some of these races, including that Stephen Foster, a race that I know I'm looking forward to quite a bit, Craig. It's not a grade 2 this year, but given the field they assembled, I wouldn't be surprised to see it upgraded to a grade 1 next year. It feels like this is a nice group of older horses, and I'm excited to see them do battle on Saturday.
Yeah, we definitely could see some Breeders' Cup Classic runners in here for sure. There's probably 3, 4, maybe 5 that have the credentials right now to show up in the starting gate that day if they can hold their form. And I think it's going to be a really intriguing matchup. You mentioned the pace. It's pretty cloudy. You got 3 horses drawn inside that all have good tactical speed but don't have to have the lead. Mandaloon's one that even he's probably going to track those 3 and try to run them down. It'll be interesting to see if he can regain that form and if the race in Saudi Arabia was just a bit of an aberration. But yeah, really looking forward to this one. And as a speed figure guy, I love these kind of races because you almost know for sure it's going to get a big number.
Well, Craig, thanks as always, and thanks to you for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. As I said, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast when we come back to recap these races next Tuesday.